I knew you were up to it, Gaurav. To follow Amy is a daunting challenge, but you did it. You hit the mark. We've been treated, therefore, thus far to an example of, in the nonprofit arena, to aggregation and analysis of clinical trial data. And then with Amy and Gaurav, the opportunities that exist in real-world data take it to real-world evidence, first at scale, and very importantly, the curation aspects that are essential to it, and then the incorporation of biomarkers and patient selection and stratification, again, at scale. Clearly, there's grounds here for many good questions, and we're looking forward to those coming from the audience. But before we do, I'm pleased to introduce no one probably here because you know him well, but we consider him the padrino. You know, in Italian, that's the godfather. That, yes, the FDA is truly in the case of Sean Khozin, our padrino, because no matter what we do, how clever we are and how collaborative, pre or post-competitive collaborative we are, there is a small orifice through which everything is going to pass in order for patients, again, patients, to be benefited. And that's the party that we're going to hear from. The kabuki dance that the FDA and we, or those in industry, used to have to perform years and years and years ago is long since past. There is true, not just communication, but a patient-centered collaboration and cooperation between our agency at the FDA in the personage of Rick Pazder and the faculty that he has surrounded himself by and that he has recruited so carefully. And one of the deans of that faculty is Sean Khozin. Sean, it's a pleasure to introduce you. Sean's going to talk on whatever he wants. After all, he is from the FDA.
Thank you, Dr. Murphy. It's a privilege to be here. So I was asked to present on a very important topic dealing with pre-competitive use of algorithms to predict adverse events. And this is one of those topics that is truly, let's see if I can make this work. Oh, wrong one. So this is certainly a great idea. When I was given this topic to present on, I was very excited. It's certainly a great topic, and developing predictive algorithms using the exponential increase in computational power in the past decade or so is certainly a very promising effort. However, I must admit that Houston, we have a problem. So what could be the problem, you may ask? We need more data in order to make algorithms predictive using advanced analytical methods, including AI and machine learning, but also more meta-analytical frequentist methods. We need data because your algorithm is only going to be as smart as and predictive as your data. And especially when it comes to safety, we don't have really the data assets that we need to train highly predictive algorithms. This is a generalization. Obviously, there's a lot of clinical trial data that, when aggregated, can really start to be predictive of rare adverse events or adverse events that are idiosyncratic. However, if we look at the bulk of the activity that occurs in clinical studies, it's before the NDA and BLA stage. It's at the IND stage before the so-called valley of death. And that's where prediction, in fact, is the most important, because if the idea is to protect patients who are enrolled in clinical trials, by the time we get to the NDA and BLA stage, it may be too late, because a lot of these studies are, by definition, when they get to the NDA BLA stage, are completed, and the patients have already been exposed to the toxicities that may be associated with these therapies. This is especially important as we move into the world of combination therapies, where they can be synergistic effects, but also they can be additional idiosyncratic events that are hard to predict unless we have appropriate data to make the predictions at the IND stage. So there are fundamental issues and problems that we have to address when it comes to the evaluation of safety in clinical trials. And so I'd like to step back a little bit and talk about how we do safety signal detection at the FDA. And this actually goes beyond the FDA. Other regulatory agencies follow the same mechanism and paradigm with slight variations. So as we all know, clinical development programs are typically linear, and they're segmented into 3 distinct phases. And once you go from your preclinical to the clinical phase, and in the United States, because you cannot ship drugs across state lines, you have to open an IND with the FDA. And the primary authority of the FDA at that point is to preside over safety. We typically cannot, for example, put INDs on hold because we don't believe that the drug is not effective. However, if there's a safety problem, that's where the FDA's authority resides. And the way that we monitor safety at this stage is through evaluation of mandatory reporting of safety events, and that is 7- and 15-day expedited pre-market safety reports. So these are safety events that are important enough that sponsors have to submit them within 7 or 15 days, depending on the severity of the event. And these reports have to go to the FDA, but they're also distributed to IRBs, investigators, and other regulators across the globe. Every country, every regulatory agency outside the United States has similar pre-market safety reporting criteria. And there is also annual reports. And that's the authority that the FDA has at this stage. And most regulatory agencies also outside the US, follow the same schema. And again, when if you're lucky enough and you overcome the barriers that are very well described in clinical development programs and overcoming the challenges of the valley of death, you submit an application to the FDA as an NDA and a BLA. And that's the first time that actually the FDA receives data and starts to look at both efficacy and safety. And the FDA's authority at that stage has the additional efficacy determination. So let's look at the data assets throughout the clinical development and how safety signal detection specifically is done throughout clinical development. So when you look at the bulk of where the activities are in clinical development, again, the IND stage, there are many more INDs than there are NDAs and BLAs. And let's examine the data assets at that stage. There are none, and this is quite surprising. And most people don't recognize that, actually. But it's sobering to realize that safety signal detection at the IND stage is purely deductive. The FDA and other regulatory agencies read reports, we look at tables and narratives. And again, these are the 7-day and 15-day reports and the annual reports that are either faxed to the FDA or they come as PDF files through an FTP-like mechanism that we have. And again, basically, this is a deductive exercise that reviewers have to read the narratives and read the reports, memorize certain events that pique their interest, and try to connect the dots across different applications and different development programs. And at the NDA and BLA stage, that's where we switch to an analytic paradigm for determining the safety and efficacy balance, because it's at that stage where the NDA comes in that we get data essentially for the first time. And we analyze the data and look at the safety profile of the drug analytically, but also the efficacy. So CDISC, you may have heard of CDISC. That's the data standard we have at the NDA BLA stage. And the post-market phase, that's also, for the most part, analytic. We have spontaneous post-market reports that go through FAIRS. And the Office of Surveillance and Epidemiology, for the most part, receives data in the post-market setting. And there are post-market commitments and requirements that may also have additional safety data generation requirements that are reviewed analytically. However, for the most part, safety signal detection at the FDA and other regulatory agencies during the most active part of clinical development is deductive. There are no data assets. Well, we looked at this and we realized that there may be an opportunity to change that, specifically when it comes to the most important safety data and safety events that are 7 and 15-day safety reports. So this is just how pre-market safety is done, basically. And typically, reviewers have a lot of post-it notes that they put on their computers if they detect an event. And if a signal that rises to the surface, this is how it's typically detected, basically. So, how many post-its does it really take? This is just a look at the number of pre-market safety reports that from commercial sponsors that the Office of Oncology has received. This doesn't include other therapeutic areas. So from 2006 to 2015, about 200,000, close to 200,000 safety reports. That's a very large volume of safety reports, especially if you have to read the narratives. Again, this is a deductive exercise. And so it takes a lot of post-its to really do safety signal detection in the pre-market safety arena. And the number of safety reports, as many of us are aware, has been increasing over the past decade. And even if we look at the average number of safety reports per IND, that has also been increasing over the past decade. It's very interesting. We looked at the development programs. We wanted to see at what point during the life of the IND the FDA gets the most number of safety reports. It turns out to be year 6. There is year 6 during the IND's lifespan that we have noted a peak in the number of safety reports coming to the FDA. What's miraculous is that we did an audit of these safety reports. Do these safety reports actually provide any valuable information, especially since they're coming as narratives to the FDA? And I think the title of this paper says it all. Actually, the majority of the safety reports that come to the FDA are uninformative. They do not help the agency make any determination about the actual risk that may be posed to the patient. A lot of these safety reports actually talk about events that are completely unrelated to the drug, or they may be related to supportive therapies, or just the age of the patient, for example. It's not unusual for us to get a safety report, a narrative about an 80-year-old patient with a history of heart disease who has an elevation in troponin that meets the reporting criteria because of the elevation of the troponin, but the sponsors know and the investigators realize that it's not related to the drug, and they send that report to the FDA as a narrative. So sifting through all these narratives and looking at these events, it turns out that not only the mechanism of reporting is inadequate, but also the reports that are coming in are uninformative. So in this audit, we found that only 14% of the reports that we receive are informative. And this is a huge burden. It's a huge burden on sponsors and companies that have to collect this information, format it, and fax it, or send it as a PDF file to the FDA and other regulatory bodies, but also to investigators and IRBs who have to legally review these reports. And it's also a huge burden to the FDA reviewers. And this is a survey we did in April of 2016, trying to assess that burden on the FDA, on the primary reviewers. And reviewers spend an average of 16% of their time on reading, on actually the paperwork that's associated with reading the narratives. That's 16%. The median is about 10%. So it's a huge chunk of time that is spent on essentially just looking at these narratives and trying to understand these events. And we clearly saw that was there was a lot of room for improvement there, and there's some foundational changes that need to occur. So the analysis that I showed and also the survey was conducted by a new data science and technology incubator that we have at the FDA called Information Exchange and Data Transformation. Originally, this was launched about 2 years ago at the Oncology Center of Excellence, but Dr. Gottlieb, our commissioner, following his announcement at Datapalooza in April, is giving us new authorities to expand this incubator agency-wide and try to connect the dots and essentially to support the integration of data analytics into regulatory decision-making. So following this announcement, we are being given new authorities that will help streamline a lot of our projects, but also it puts us even closer to the public health mission of the FDA. So Informed is essentially a sandbox for collaborative regulatory science research, and we've done a number of meta-analyses in the past couple of years, and we've published a lot of papers, and we have had many abstracts at primarily oncology related meetings. And we continue to do that. As you know, at the ENDA BLA stage, as I showed, we actually have a lot of data. So over the years, the FDA has accumulated a large repository of CDISC data and clinical trial data at the ENDA and BLA stage. So we've done a number of meta-analyses, and that's an effort that continues. We've been looking at electronic health record data primarily through partnerships. And actually, a lot of work that we do outside of the clinical trial domain is through partnerships with groups such as Project Datasphere, Flatiron, NCI, other federal agencies. So it's a collaborative sandbox, and it's very bottom-up. And then the successes then are scaled in collaboration with leadership and center directors. We also have a biometric program where we're testing the utility of biosensors to capture the patient's experience, both in terms of understanding their quality of life when they're under active treatment, but also certain safety events that may occur that we may not be able to fully characterize by looking at traditional streams of data, such as laboratory or clinical information. And the output of a lot of what we do, again, we do a lot of publications, abstracts, but more and more we find ourselves that we're sitting on very valuable algorithms and code, and that we now are in the process of developing a path for dissemination of these algorithms that can be trained on additional sets of data by folks outside the FDA to make them more predictive. So in terms of safety, one of the things that we did, realizing that there is really no safety signal detection at the IND stage of clinical development, again, the most active area of clinical development globally, we embarked on a project to create a new data asset at this stage, basically digitizing the pre-market safety reporting process. So we were successful in doing this. Essentially what we did, we developed an API, we connected it to the sponsor's safety database, and then through certain engineering maneuvers, essentially once a 7-day or 15-day report is a safety event, I should say, is detected, instead of having companies to go through regulatory affairs, going through the process of writing a cover letter, and putting the narratives on a MedWatch form, as is typically done, which is a very convoluted and oftentimes expensive way of routing these events to the FDA. We now have the capability after this pilot to receive data. So we published the results of this pilot, and we conducted this pilot in 2016 with Merck, AstraZeneca, Genentech, and Novartis. So this was a successful pilot. These are the results of the pilots that we published. And since then, we've been working on implementing this across the FDA. And now we have a very large implementation program. And Informed is essentially working with the Office of the Commissioner to implement this program agency-wide. And for the first time, we'll be moving, we'll have data to actually analyze and predict signals when it comes to the IND stage of clinical development. And you can imagine that this data asset can be highly valuable because now we can actually start to, well, do bar graphs. That would be transformative, but also do train algorithms. This is a very, we're hoping that this will really start to create new efficiencies, not just for the FDA, but the entire clinical development enterprise. So if you remember the 16% that I mentioned, just the Office of Oncology will save about 200 to 300 full-time equivalent hours a month once we transition fully into this digital framework, which now we're expecting to occur in the middle of 2019. As you can imagine, this is a very complex effort, not from a technology standpoint. This is actually what we did. We essentially took an existing standard that is known to companies in the post-market stage. It's called the E2B standard. Use an existing gateway that the FDA has, the FAERS gateway, to receive the data. FAERS is essentially the only way that the FDA can receive data as a transactional technology system. The CDIS data during clinical trials, it's essentially sent like an FTP-like pathway to the FDA, but this is transactional. So we use the existing resources. That's why implementation is actually not very costly because we based this on the post-market safety data standards, and companies already have a gateway that communicates with the FDA. So by mid-2019, we'll be at full implementation of this program. But what's interesting, after we published this paper, we got a lot of emails from investigators and other global regulators. Well, this is going to be great for the FDA, and obviously companies will have new efficiencies as well. What about investigators, and what about other agencies across the globe? And that really piqued our interest. And now we conducted a global assessment of safety reporting practices. And we found significant discrepancies and inefficiencies that could actually be solved by this digital framework. So we started a program which is called the Global Safety Data Bank Program. And the idea is to create a global central bank where all companies basically send the pre-market safety reports, well, I should say data, as data sets to this global bank. And then this bank provisions access to whoever is supposed to have access to the data, regulators, investigators, and IRBs. The companies would only have to do it once. Typically what happens right now, since there are slight variations in regulatory requirements, for example, a company may have up to 1,000 ways of sending these reports globally. So this will just harmonize all of that and create very massive efficiencies in the process. But and also for the first time, it will create a pre-competitive sandbox where safety data can be looked at in completely new ways. And this global safety bank will meet the statutory requirements of safety reporting globally. So that is its primary function. However, you could envision that as the member companies can decide to look at classifiers, they can decide to train algorithms, predictive algorithms, to actually catch events during the IND stage of clinical development which is actually the most important part, because if the idea is to protect the patients, that's where we should be putting a lot of our efforts, because by the time, again, the NDA gets to the FDA and other regulatory agencies, the trial has been conducted and patients have already been exposed to the toxicities. And there was recently an ASCO workshop where we actually talked about this idea and some of the work that the FDA and Inform has done in the area of pre-market safety. And this was a recent publication where ASCO incorporated this into one of their official recommendations that a neutral third party should develop a central electronic portal for reporting AEs. And so we have been championing this, and we have been engaging and convening all the right stakeholders. And once this global safety bank is seeded, obviously this is something that the FDA supports. The FDA will likely not manage and own this central data bank. It really has to be done by a neutral third party. And right now, from the input that we've received from stakeholders and sponsors, this is a very attractive value proposition, and we're going to be moving forward with creation of this central bank in the next year or so. And then we're hoping that the community will pick up where we left off and start to integrate safety information as data sets for the first time in clinical trials. Thank you.